There's a particular kind of silence that makes toxic people uncomfortable. It's not the empty quiet of someone who's given up, or the brittle silence of suppressed rage. It's something far more unsettling. It's the stillness of someone who has stopped trying to fix what was never broken in the first place. She sat across from him, her hands folded, watching as he launched into his familiar routine of excuses and deflections. But something had shifted. Where there used to be anxious energy, desperate attempts to smooth things over, there was now an almost surgical calm. She wasn't finding him anymore. She wasn't even engaging. She was simply observing, as if studying a specimen under glass. This is what happens when an empath reaches the end of their rope and discovers it wasn't a rope at all. It was a leash. And the moment they realize this, everything changes. Not just for them, but for everyone who had grown comfortable feeding off their endless capacity to absorb pain that wasn't theirs to carry. For decades, psychology has painted empaths as society's emotional sponges, always giving, perpetually drained, beautiful in their selflessness, but ultimately vulnerable to those who would exploit their gift. This narrative serves everyone except the empath themselves. It keeps them small, manageable, and available for emotional labor that enriches others while depleting their own reserves. But there's another side to this story, one that predators hope you never discover. The same sensitivity that makes you vulnerable in unconscious hands becomes an unparalleled weapon when wielded with awareness. Your ability to read between the lines, to sense what people aren't saying, to detect the micro-expressions that betray hidden motives. These aren't weaknesses disguised as strengths. They're reconnaissance tools in the hands of someone who's learned to stop apologizing for their accuracy.
The transformation doesn't happen overnight. It builds slowly, through years of dismissed intuitions, gaslighted perceptions, and boundaries crossed so subtly you almost convince yourself you imagined it. Until one day, you don't. One day, the evidence becomes too overwhelming to ignore, and something crystallizes inside you that can never be undone. What emerges isn't the wounded empath anymore. It's something predators were never prepared to face. An empath who trusts their own judgment completely. And that terrifies them more than any confrontation ever could. Manipulators have spent lifetimes perfecting their craft on people who doubt themselves. They've learned to exploit the gap between what you sense and what you're willing to believe. They rely on your second guessing, your desire to see the best in people, your willingness to carry responsibility that isn't yours. But when that gap closes, when perception and belief align perfectly, their entire playbook becomes obsolete. Picture this. Someone tries to gaslight you about something you clearly remember. In the past, you might have felt that familiar knot in your stomach, that voice whispering, "Maybe I'm remembering wrong." But now you know with absolute certainty what happened. You don't need external validation because your internal compass has been calibrated by experience. The manipulation attempt doesn't create confusion, it creates clarity about them. This is the nightmare scenario for narcissists and emotional predators. They've built their identity around being the smartest person in the room, the one who controls the narrative. But suddenly, they're facing someone who sees through their performance in real time. Someone who knows their patterns better than they know themselves. And the most unnerving part, this person isn't trying to expose them or destroy them. They simply aren't participating in the illusion anymore.
The awakened empath doesn't fight. They observe. They don't defend. They document. They don't react. They respond with the kind of measured precision that comes from having all the information while the other person believes they're still controlling the story. Imagine the frustration of someone accustomed to pushing emotional buttons only to find the control panel has been disconnected. Every manipulation tactic falls flat against someone who can predict it 3 moves ahead. Guilt trips are met with polite boundaries. Love bombing is recognized as the desperate manipulation it is. Rage is answered with the kind of calm that makes the raging person look unhinged by contrast. This transformation is irreversible because it's not based on anger or revenge, emotions that can fade or be manipulated. It's based on knowledge. And once you truly understand how the game is played, you can never unknow it. You can never go back to being the person who made excuses for inexcusable behavior, or who twisted themselves into pretzels to avoid someone else's discomfort. The most dangerous part of this evolution isn't the empath's new ability to see through deception. It's their complete lack of need to prove they're right. They don't need acknowledgement of the truth because they're no longer seeking validation from the very people who gaslit them into doubting it in the first place. This self-contained certainty is what makes them untouchable. For years, you collected data without realizing it. Every broken promise, every subtle put-down disguised as concern, every time their story changed when pressed for details. Your mind cataloged it all, even when your heart wanted to believe their explanations. Now, that archive becomes your greatest asset, not because you want to weaponize it, but because it protects you from ever being fooled the same way twice.
The cold empath doesn't announce their transformation. They don't make dramatic declarations or threats. They simply become someone who can no longer be moved by manipulative tactics. And predators can sense this shift. Like animals sensing an earthquake, they feel the ground has changed beneath their feet, even if they can't articulate how. What makes this particularly threatening to narcissists is that the cold empath still looks like the same person. They haven't become cruel or vindictive. They're still capable of tremendous compassion and understanding. But now, these qualities come with terms and conditions. Their empathy has become selective, offered freely to those who've earned it, and withheld from those who've proven they'll exploit it. This selectivity is what changes everything. When empathy becomes a conscious choice rather than an automatic response, the entire dynamic shifts. The people who've grown comfortable taking without giving suddenly find themselves cut off from their supply source. And unlike other forms of confrontation they're prepared for, this isn't something they can argue with or manipulate their way around. The silence speaks louder than any accusation could. The calm withdrawal of energy hits harder than any explosion of anger. The complete absence of the expected emotional response leaves them with nothing to deflect, nothing to turn around on you, nothing to use to paint themselves as the victim of your overreaction. This is the power that narcissists fear most. Not your anger, which they can use, but your indifference, which they cannot. Not your words, which they can twist, but your actions, which speak for themselves. Not your attempts to make them understand, which will always fail, but your decision to stop trying, which succeeds immediately.
The transformation completes when you realize that you don't need them to change. You don't need them to acknowledge what they've done. You don't need closure or apologies or explanations. You simply need them to be irrelevant to your peace of mind. And when you reach that point, you discover something remarkable. They become exactly that. The ripple effects extend far beyond your relationship with obvious predators. Friends notice you're harder to guilt into commitments you don't want. Family members realize their emotional manipulation tactics no longer work. Colleagues find they can't dump their responsibilities on you with a sob story. The entire ecosystem that once relied on your boundaryless giving has to restructure itself around the reality of your new limits. Some relationships improve because they rise to meet your new standards. Others simply end because they were built on an unsustainable foundation of one-sided giving. And while this can be painful initially, it clears space for connections that nourish rather than drain you. The most profound shift is internal. You stop feeling guilty for protecting your own well-being. You stop apologizing for your perceptions. You stop explaining yourself to people who've proven they'll weaponize whatever you share. This isn't cynicism, it's wisdom earned through experience. You develop what I call strategic empathy, the ability to understand what someone is feeling without taking responsibility for fixing it. You can acknowledge someone's pain without absorbing it. You can offer compassion without compromising your boundaries. This balanced approach protects both your energy and the integrity of your relationships.
The final stage of this evolution is perhaps the most powerful. You become someone who helps others recognize their own worth, not through preaching or advice giving, but through modeling. When people see someone who refuses to accept poor treatment, it gives them permission to expect better for themselves too. Your transformation becomes a catalyst for others to examine their own boundaries and relationships. This is why the cold empath represents such a threat to systems built on exploitation. They don't just remove themselves from the equation, they inspire others to do the same. They become living proof that you don't have to tolerate the intolerable, that your sensitivity is a gift to be treasured, not a weakness to be exploited. The narcissist's power has always depended on keeping empaths isolated and doubting themselves. But an empath who trusts their perceptions and values their own well-being becomes a lighthouse for others lost in similar storms. And there's nothing a predator fears more than their prey becoming wise to the game. So if you recognize yourself in this description, if you felt that shift from absorption to observation, from reaction to response, know that you're not becoming cold, you're becoming whole. You're not losing your empathy, you're choosing where to direct it. And that choice, that conscious wielding of your gift rather than unconscious bleeding of it, is what transforms you from prey into something far more dangerous to those who would exploit you. An example of what's possible when empaths stop apologizing for taking up space in their own lives. The transformation is complete when you realize that your greatest power was never your ability to endure mistreatment. It was your ability to recognize it, understand it, and choose differently. And once you've made that choice, truly made it, you become someone no narcissist wants to tangle with, not because you'll fight them, but because you won't play their game at all. That's the cold empath's ultimate power. The ability to make manipulation irrelevant through sheer indifference to its effects. And in a world built on emotional leverage, there's nothing more revolutionary than someone who simply cannot be moved by tactics that once controlled them completely.